The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great stories since 1898. If you find Ottawa's history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook, and enjoy today's segment.
Hi, my name is Steve Rennie, and I'm a baseball writer and historian, and I'm going to be here talking to you today about Ottawa's long history with professional baseball, amateur and professional baseball, going back to the 1860s. I'm also the president of the Society for American Baseball Research's chapter here in Ottawa, so if you're interested, you can always check that out. We do a lot of work on baseball history in the area. But Ottawa's baseball history is a long and varied one, a very colorful one as well. So it really starts back in around 1860. And at that time, baseball was just really gaining popularity. It was very big already in the United States, particularly in New York. But the game had been spreading across upstate New York and to places like Ogdensburg. And in Ogdensburg in 1860, they were playing a lot of baseball. And it wasn't long before they started crossing the river to play games against Prescott. And in fact, one of the very first international games between Canada and the United States was between a team from Prescott and a team from Ogdensburg in September of 1860. That was only a few weeks after the very first documented game in the Niagara area between a Canadian and American team. So Eastern Ontario's history with baseball goes back a really long way. I think what helped the spread of baseball to Ottawa was the building of the Prescott to Ottawa Railway in the 1850s. And that really helped people move around and travel more easily between the two cities. Ottawa's first recorded instance of baseball actually took place at a fair in the town of Metcalfe in 1865. And if you go through the newspapers from that time, you see a write-up from the fair, and they talk about all the different activities that were happening at the time. So there was potato sack races and all kinds of different games, and among the different games was baseball. And it's really interesting when you read the article because it doesn't mention baseball as some new sport or some unknown sport to people in Ottawa. It talks about baseball just very matter-of-factly among the other sports that were being played. That suggests that people were already playing the game and knew how to play the game before they showed up that day in September of 1865. And so that's really the first documented instance of baseball in the Ottawa area. Now, 2 years later, Ottawa gets its first real team, and that's the New Dominion Club. The New Dominion Club probably took its name from the newly formed Dominion of Canada in 1867. And they were made up of different people from around the city, so tradespeople and merchants and all kinds of different people gathered to play baseball in 1867. And they were very audacious. And so the first year of their existence in 1867, they decided to travel down to Ogdensburg and play the team down there. Now, the Ogdensburg team had been around for a number of years at this point, and they were quite good. And so the Ottawa team went down and played, and not surprisingly, lost very badly by a score of 141-20. Just to put in perspective, back then the scores were really, really high, and that owed a lot to the fact that the players didn't have the same equipment that we have today. So they didn't have gloves, so it made it harder to catch the ball. The pitching rules were different. And but even by those standards, it was still a blowout loss, and Ottawa did quite poorly. The newspapers at the time were forgiving, and they mentioned the fact that even though the Ottawa team didn't seem all that familiar with the rules and didn't necessarily understand the finer points of the game, they were good athletes, and probably within a year with more practice, they'd be a lot more competitive. And they turned out to be right. So in 1868, the New Dominion Club is now the biggest club in Ottawa. They have over 60 members, and one of the challenges they faced was just they didn't have a lot of people to play. There weren't many other teams in the city. So a lot of those games in 1868 were against themselves. They would break the team into a first half and a second half, and they'd play each other or they'd play games against local mechanics, or they'd play games against others from around the city. But they didn't have a lot of tough competition. Well, that changed when Ogdensburg came back to Ottawa in the summer of 1868. And Ottawa was actually leading the game for a few innings. And it looked like things might go their way, but they ended up losing the game, very close game, and were quite pleased with themselves. And then after the game, as was customary at the time, the Ogdensburg and Ottawa teams had a supper together and celebrated long into the night. So Ottawa then found themselves again with very few credible opponents to play. So they organized a series of games against the local cricket club. So they played 2 games of baseball and 2 games of cricket. Not surprisingly, they did pretty well in the baseball games, not as great in the cricket games. Then Ogdensburg came back again later that summer in August. And Ottawa was really thinking they had a good chance of maybe this time winning against the Ogdensburg team. Unfortunately, it was another blowout loss and left the Ottawa team quite demoralized. They didn't expect that they would do quite as badly after having come so close earlier that summer. Then, for all intents and purposes, the New Dominion Club disappears. We don't hear much about them throughout the rest of 1868, and there's only one lone mention of them in 1869. And it wasn't until a few years later that we found out why that was. Turned out that the land on which their clubhouse was located at the Ottawa Skating and Curling Club on Albert Street had been sold and subdivided into lots. So the team lost its clubhouse and disbanded. And so that was the end of the New Dominion Club. But many of the players from that original team went on to form the Ottawa Baseball Club in 1871. And this team was very ambitious. One of the first things they did in the summer of 1872 was to build a new ballpark at the corner of what's now Cartier and Gladstone Avenue. And it had a fence around it, it had concessions, it had a grandstand. It was really quite a large facility. And it was located in what was then the outskirts of the city of Ottawa. So it was in a village called Stewarton. So there was lots of land, and this is where people would go for the summer to vacation. And so this is where they built the new ballpark. The reason they built the ballpark was because they had a plan to play the Boston Red Stockings. Now, the Boston Red Stockings at the time were the biggest ball club in the world. They were just packed with future Hall of Famers like Albert Spalding and Ross Barnes. And they were touring around North America doing something called barnstorming, where they would go to different cities and they would play local teams and help them raise some money for themselves. And so they came to Ottawa in the summer of 1872. Now, just to put this into perspective, you have to imagine that, the Red Stockings, they're professional, they've been playing for years, they're full of amazingly talented athletes. So they come into town and they're playing what's the equivalent of a beer league baseball team. They've got a group of ragtag merchants and different tradespeople, and they're not terribly experienced. And so this day in 1872, was a civic holiday. And so in the morning, a lot of the people who would have gone to the baseball game later had gone to see a cricket match at Rideau Hall involving the English cricketers traveling team had come. So people had gone in the morning to see that. And then in the afternoon, they went down to the ballpark to see Ottawa play the Red Stockings. And the Red Stockings came in on this horse-drawn, called a bus, but really more of like a carriage. And as they stepped off the bus, the people in town were just amazed to see just these athletes. They were muscular, they were athletic, they had these beautiful uniforms on, and they just looked the part. So even during the warm-ups, people were just oohing and awing at the throws they were making and the catches they were making, and it was just a really impressive showing. And this is before the game had even started. And across the field, you had the Ottawa team, who was just trying their best, and I don't think anybody thought they had a real chance of actually winning that game. Now, if this was Hollywood, of course, the Ottawa team would have somehow managed to pull out a win, and it would have been quite a story. But it's not Hollywood, it's real life, and Ottawa lost really badly, 64-0, and it was not close. So the best thing that came out of that game, though, was that it really got people in Ottawa quite excited about baseball. For the first time, they had seen what professional baseball could look like. They saw the Red Stockings at their best, and they saw that there was a potential for this game to be something more than it had been in Ottawa to that point. It also left a mark on the Red Stockings. They were really, really impressed with Ottawa's facilities, and they were really impressed with the way that they had gone about arranging this game. And so they agreed to come back the following year. And so when they did come back the next year, Ottawa had again been practicing. Their baseball in the city had been growing slowly, but they still lost. It was a little bit closer, but it wasn't by any stretch competitive. But it was a good way to, again, revive interest or start interest in Ottawa for baseball and get people really excited about it. Now, the 1870s were a really interesting period in Ottawa's baseball history. The city is expanding, it's growing, it's becoming more prosperous, and teams start to form largely divided along occupational lines. So we had teams of merchants playing teams of tradespeople, popping up all over the city with really interesting names. You had the Victorias and the Mutuals and the Olympics, and even an office furniture store club formed, and they were playing each other throughout the 1870s and 1880s. One of the things you noticed in the newspapers back then is that the teams would often challenge themselves in the newspapers. So you might have a team writing in to say that such and such baseball club issues an open challenge to any competitors in the city to come and play a game of baseball against them. And then you would invariably have a few days later, another team would come and say, well, we're ready to play the team that issued the challenge, and we're happy to do it anytime, any place. And so this would go back and forward until the game was eventually held, and the game would be covered, and then they'd move on to the next one. And these were pretty common occurrences in the newspapers back then. And it really did a lot to get people interested in the game of baseball. So they weren't just covering the games themselves, they were covering all the circumstances around the game, all the pageantry leading up to the game, all the challenges ahead of the game. And so these things were going on at the time. But professional baseball was still a long way away. We were still in a period of very amateur baseball. So these players were not being paid at all to play the game. They were still very new to the game. They were traveling, but not a great deal. And most of the games were played within Ottawa and the surrounding areas. So you might have games in Merrickville or Kempville, Metcalfe, places like that. But the teams didn't tend to travel too far to play against each other. One of Ottawa's early baseball pioneers was a man named Tom Clough. And Tom Clough had been a member of the New Dominion Club when it formed in the 1860s. And he was later a member of the Ottawa Baseball Club when it formed in the early 1870s. Now, Tom Clough sometimes gets credited as being the man who started baseball in Ottawa. But I'm going to tell you why that's not the case. Tom Clough had been living in Ohio during the Civil War, and he had stayed down there. And the story goes that in the late 1860s, Tom Clough had been at a picnic in Ohio, and he happened to see the Cincinnati Red Stockings, a different team than the Boston Red Stockings, but the Cincinnati Red Stockings were putting on a baseball exhibition, throwing the ball around and putting on a show. And the story goes that Tom Clough became so just completely enamored by this display that he approached the players after they'd put on their exhibition and asked them all about this strange game they were playing. And they gave him a bat and a ball and a set of rule books and sent it back to Ottawa, where he popularized the game. We know that's not true because before this picnic would have happened, we know Tom Clough was playing for the New Dominion Club. So the story does fall apart under some scrutiny. So while it's clear that Tom Clough was not the originator of baseball in Ottawa, he was certainly one of its early founding members. And he went on to become fire chief and a really well-known figure in the community in the city of Ottawa before his death in the early 1900s. So as the game is spreading in the 1880s, Ottawa forms the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club. And this is sort of an umbrella organization that oversaw a lot of the amateur sports in the city at the time. So they had baseball and other sports. And it was as much of a sports club as it was a social club. So you could pay a certain amount of money per year or per month to join the club. It was really catering towards the more affluent members of the city. It would have been quite a bit of money at the time to join the club. So I think it was $10 a year or $2 a month, which was a considerable bit of money back then. This team, this sports club is notable because they helped popularize the colors that we now associate with Ottawa sports teams today. So the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club wore the red, the black, and the white colors that we see on teams like the Ottawa Senators, the Ottawa Red Blacks, the Ottawa Titans, and countless other Ottawa teams that have played here over the years. And that really helped identify those colors with this city. And they were one of the first, if not the first, sports team to wear those colors. Now, Amateur baseball carries on in Ottawa throughout the 1870s and the 1880s. And by the 1890s, there's starting to become more of an appetite for the professional game here. Now, Ottawa hasn't seen professional baseball yet. All the games have been amateur. And in 1898, the Ottawa Citizen starts a campaign to try to get professional baseball in Ottawa. And so they start writing about how other teams around the eastern part of the United States that are much smaller than Ottawa have teams. And it's a shame that Ottawa doesn't have a team, and they think that it would be a really good opportunity for Ottawa to do this. And so over a series of articles that span a number of weeks, the Citizen starts writing more and more about why it would be a good idea for Ottawa to get a team. Now at the time, the Spanish-American War is going on, and it's really doing a number on baseball attendance across North America. People are not going out to baseball games. And one of the clubs that is struggling the most with this is Rochester. So Rochester in 1898 is just back. The previous year, Rochester had lost its club to Montreal under similar circumstances. They weren't doing well at the box office and people weren't seeing games, so the team had moved to Montreal. They get a team back in 1898, but unfortunately circumstances conspire against them and they're not looking like they're going to be long for Rochester. And so the Eastern League starts getting worried. And they convene a meeting of all the owners to try to figure out what to do about this Rochester situation. And so it emerges with two leading contenders at that point. Worcester, Massachusetts, and Ottawa emerge as the two leading contenders for the Rochester team to be relocated to. And it ends up being Ottawa. And so in July of 1898, the Ottawa team, or the Rochester team, boards a ferry, and they cross over to the Canadian side and take a train to Ottawa, where they're greeted by a huge crowd of cheering people who are really excited to see them. And there's a parade down to Lansdowne Park. And they're very excited about the opportunity to play baseball in their new city. Early on, they realized that they're going to need a place to play. Lansdowne would have been the natural place for the new team to play in. But unfortunately, there were some challenges with that. One being that the local cricket team had the lease to Lansdowne, so they weren't able to bump the cricket club from their games. The other challenge was that Ottawa had laws in place at the time that made it so that you couldn't play baseball on Sundays. It was something you had to do over across the river in Gatineau. So they had already a very slim pickings in their schedule to choose from. And so they agreed to play a couple of games at Lansdowne, but then they moved to another ballpark that I'll talk about in a second, the Metropolitan Grounds. So Ottawa shows up for their first game, and they're still wearing their old Rochester uniforms. And they're all in different states of disarray. So the teams would typically have the name of their city on the front of the uniform. So in this case, it would say Rochester. Now, the uniforms they were wearing was sort of an alphabet soup of different letterings. So you had some teams that had Roch, some teams that said Chester, some teams that had some combination of those two, just peeling off their uniforms. And the players looked understandably nervous. They had a huge crowd of people there to see them play. They had their first game, and then they played a second game a couple of days later. And then after that, they moved to their new stadium at the Metropolitan Grounds. The Ottawa team did pretty well that summer. Through most of July and August, they had about a 500 record, so they won about half as many games as they lost. So things were going okay for the team. Attendance was not bad. But then things just went off a cliff in August. They went on this massive losing streak. People stopped going to the games. The newspaper that had been so supportive of them started turning against them and mocking them. And it just was not a good situation for the team. And they ended up finishing last that year. After the season ended, the team disbanded, and that was it for professional baseball in Ottawa for the next few years. The team is sometimes called the Wanderers if you look them up on the internet, but that's actually wrong. If you read the old newspapers from the time, they were actually called the Senators, and they would have been the first sports club in Ottawa to be known as the Senators. And what happened was a Toronto sports writer had made a comment when the Ottawa team, the team was relocated to Ottawa, mentioning that Washington has its Senators, and so it would be befitting of Canada's capital if our team was called the Senators as well. Well, Ottawa sports writers latched onto this, and then they started referring to the team as the Senators. So there's numerous newspaper articles from the time that called them the Senators. So that would be, again, the very first team that would have been the Senators. So I mentioned the Metropolitan Grounds a second ago. That would have been on Pretoria Avenue near what was then Jane Street. It was one of many sites around the city where people would have played baseball in the 1800s. One of the other areas that was really interesting was Cartier Square, so the area just in front of what's now City Hall. And that was owned by the Department of Militia and Defense. One of the things that made that particularly unique and very Ottawa in a lot of ways was that you had to obtain permission in writing from the Minister of Militia Defense if you wanted to practice there. And so how this worked was if your team wanted to play, you'd have to send a letter off to the Minister of Militia and Defense asking for permission to play on Tuesday night. And a couple of days would pass, and you'd get a letter back on official letterhead saying, you can play there, just don't get in the way of any drills. And that was good enough, and you can go ahead and do it. So it wasn't like you could just show up and play a pickup game there. You had to get permission to do that. There were other places around the city where people played as well. Rideau Hall was a popular area. And there were also games that took place in different parts of the city. So Spark Street occasionally had games where people would just show up and play baseball. Sandy Hill was another popular area, although there was comments in the newspaper from people at the time who would complain about youth out there playing baseball and being disruptive and rowdy, which is funny to think about because today, you would want kids out there being active instead of sitting on their phones. So it's funny to think how things have changed so much in this time. So those were some of the more popular places where baseball was played in the city. So Ottawa's history, as you can see with baseball, goes back more than 150 years. It's got some amazingly colorful characters. It actually goes back further than places like Montreal. Montreal's baseball history starts a couple of years after Ottawa. So we do have a very long history with the game. And I think sometimes Ottawa's baseball history gets overlooked because bigger cities like Toronto and Montreal really command more of the attention just because they've had professional teams playing there before. But Ottawa's had its own successes over the years. So in addition to what I mentioned from the 1800s, we've had AAA baseball here on a couple of occasions. So in the 1950s, we had the Athletics and we had the Giants, which were AAA clubs that played here. And of course, in the 90s, we had the Ottawa Lynx, which played here till 2007. So professional baseball has had its time in Ottawa, and I think the city is often thought of as a hockey city, but I think originally we could say that it was very much a baseball city. So with that, I hope you found this interesting. If you're interested in finding out more about Ottawa baseball history, like I said, the Society for American Baseball Research, Ottawa chapter, you can just reach out and we would be happy to have a chat with you about Ottawa baseball. You could also, if you're interested, there's a couple of publications that have come out. So the Historical Society of Ottawa published Forgotten Gems, which was a pamphlet about what I've just spoken about, Ottawa's early baseball history. And earlier this year, the Society for American Baseball Research published From Bytown to the Big Leagues, for which I'm an editor and one of the writers. And this covers not just early Ottawa baseball history, but it also covers everything up to and including the Titans of today. So if you're interested in baseball from the certain periods, so whether it was the early amateur teams or some of the teams in the early 1900s, you can find all about that here. And so you can get that. Both of them are available in the library, but you can also, if you want to get a copy of the book, it's available at all booksellers around that you can find. So thank you again for your attention, and really happy to chat about Ottawa baseball.